Well, welcome back to Men in Balance. Today we're talking to a good friend of mine and someone you'll want to know more about. It's John Kuykendall, former president of Davidson College and now resident at the Pines, along with me. Hello, John.
Hey, how are you?
Good. I am so glad to have you on here. Good to talk to you. Um, because I know a little bit about you, I wanted to talk some about your early childhood because I know it was on a farm down near Nations Ford Road. So tell us a little bit about that before we get into the heavy stuff.
Okay. My grandfather retired in 1939 in Charlotte, and he had always, though he'd been a minister and an educator all his life, somewhere in the back of his mind, having grown up on a farm, he figured he was supposed to be a gentleman farmer. A bad mistake. He wasn't, but he bought 120 acres out on Nations Ford Road. Our mailbox was right where Nations Ford Road has intersection with I-77 going south out of Charlotte. And it began as a dairy farm, and when World War II started, my grandfather, who was probably in his late 60s, early 70s, couldn't manage it by himself, so he sold all the cows. And so I guess I grew up basically on an inert farm. We had a lot of pasture land, 4 barns. We had chickens and maybe an occasional pig or two, a couple of mules, but it was not like Jimmy Carter's farming experience. I grew up just sitting in the middle of pretty much bare land and having that for my play yard, which was just wonderful, wandering through the woods, through the forest. We had a stream that ran through the property, so a lot of things to get in trouble with. Lived on the farm, but my brother, when we moved out there, my older brother had begun school at Dilworth School in Charlotte, and you could do that back in the day by just paying tuition. They had a county system and a city system, and the county system was really not very convenient to where we lived, so my parents just continued to pay a modest tuition, and Bill and I went to public schools. I went to Dilworth, I went to AG, I went to Myers Park, so was in town, quote unquote, most of the days of my life after I started school, but lived on the farm and was there in the summertime and on weekends.
So talk us through from that point to your starting at Davidson and meeting Missy and all of that.
Oh, that's the fun part. My dad had gone to Davidson, and he'd come from West Virginia, first in his immediate family to go to college, but he came to Davidson and he was followed there by his 2 younger brothers. And then subsequently, when my brother Bill finished high school, he went to Davidson. And so when my time came, I had a brief flurry of interest in thinking about maybe going somewhere else. And I went home from a college night at high school and said that a good friend of ours had been there representing a certain college, and it looked so nice, and I thought maybe I'd like to apply there. And I got the old line of, well, you can go anywhere you want to, but if I'm going to help you, you're going to go to Davidson. So that was kind of settled for me. Fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go to Davidson, and spent 4 very, very happy years as an undergraduate at Davidson. Did a lot of things I had not done before, didn't know I could do, such as played on a varsity team, a soccer team. I was a 4-year ROTC cadet, got involved in student government, and just did a lot of things. Really enjoyed those 4 years and made friends who are friends for a lifetime. Yesterday afternoon, I had a good visit with my roommate's junior and senior year, who lives in Louisville. He's kind of like my brother, and anything that comes up, we kind of pick up right where we left off. So it was a grand 4 years. In the middle of those 4 years, there was a spring vacation in my sophomore year, and a good friend, fraternity brother of mine, lived in Mobile, Alabama, and his parents owned a big old rambling house on Mobile Bay, on the other side of the bay from the city of Mobile in Point Clear, Alabama. And Ben very bravely asked his mother to bring home about 16 of his closest friends for spring break. And I was one of those in that party. We drove down. I remember leaving Davidson after class and driving till midnight, spending the night in the middle of Alabama in on a farm, I guess plantation, owned by another friend of ours, and then driving on the next day to Mobile Bay. Well, long story short, we were good citizens and good guests for about 4 days, and then some of the natives got a little restless, and my friend's mother decided that she needed to bring some girls over to kind of calm us down a little bit. So she asked her niece, who was a high school senior, to bring her best friends over for a picnic on Sunday afternoon. And one of those girls was the most charming and intriguing person I've met in my own life. Her name was Missy Moore. And I just really, my mother said, I came home and she said, did you meet anybody? And I said, my mother said, I met the keenest girl I ever saw. That keen, that sounds like Archie and Jughead. I didn't say that word, but I may have said sharp or bright or something. But anyway, that was a girl that I fell for pretty hard. She went to Agnes Scott that next fall as a freshman, so she was 2 years behind me in college. We dated all through my 4 years at Davidson, off and on, first of all, and then fairly consistently. And then after graduating from Davidson, I spent a year on a trial year fellowship at Theological Seminary in Richmond. And we kept up our relationship then. And then as she entered her senior year, we got engaged and married about a month after she graduated from Agnes Scott. So we spent the next 59 plus years together, which has been the blessing of my life.
Yes, she's a wonderful woman, and you're lucky to have her. So talk about your time at Davidson and how you got into the ministry, and well, I guess my first question is, did you know when you went to Davidson that was where you would end up in the ministry?
Oh, I didn't. I really had no preconception about what I was going to do, except I knew I wasn't going to be pre-med. Everybody at Davidson was pre-med, and I couldn't stand the sight of blood, still can't. So I figured that was not the direction I should go. But I came with an open mind, came on a scholarship, which was sponsored by a company that wanted to produce chemists and businessmen. And so I started at Davidson for about a year as a chemistry major. The academic side of it, the classroom side of it wasn't so bad, but I was the world's worst in the laboratory. I didn't like it. It smelled bad. I thought I was going to blow something up. So after that first year, I decided, well, if I'm going to be true to the scholarship, I better try another route than chemistry. So I shifted and started taking course in economics. And that did not quite jive with my interests and abilities. I could do it, but it wasn't much fun. A lot of people were having fun, and I wasn't. And I was taking an English course from an absolutely charismatic, weird man who just really enchanted me with the study of the English language and English literature. And so in the middle of my sophomore year, I decided I just had to take every course that man taught, and then top it off with some other English courses, and I'd be an English major, which is what I did, and enjoyed every minute of it. And since then have really been grateful for the exposure it gave me to literature, essentially English and American literature, but also literature in the world more broadly, and also an effort to learn how to write and write well, because you had to. And those two things have really stuck by me the rest of my life. But along about fall of my senior year, I was very much involved in so many things. I was playing soccer. I broke my ankle about halfway through the season, or I don't think I would have graduated. But I was playing soccer. I was very active in student government. I was president of the Davidson student body at that time. It had a lot on me, but the time that was provided by being in a cast for the last 6 weeks of the first semester gave me time to think about what comes next. The easy answer was I'd stayed in ROTC, so I had a commitment to Uncle Sam, a 2-year commitment, which at that time, because of a lull between wars, we hadn't gotten into Vietnam yet. A lot of people were just going for 6 months and coming out because they didn't need us. But there was a program that was sponsored by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, which was called Trial Year Ministry Program. And it was for people who did not have the intention of going into the ministry, to give them a trial year, kind of fair field and no favors. You go for a year, and that was the only commitment, except write them a letter at the end of the year and said, I finished. So I spent a year in Theological Seminary, in Richmond, Virginia, Union Theological Seminary, Presbyterian school. And as I was finishing that year, I made arrangements to defer a bit on my commitment to the Army so that I could come back to Davidson and work in the alumni office, a one-year kind of internship in the alumni office, and then go to the Army after that. But a very wise man at the seminary, who had been one of my teachers, took me aside and said, you know, you really haven't tried seminary for a year until you go and work in a parish and see what it's like to be around people in church. So he very wisely, craftily really, sent me to a church that he had served in Anderson, South Carolina, which couldn't have been a better place for me to be at that time. They were very kind. The senior pastor there was a person that I just became devoted to, as well as to his whole family. He had 4 children, all of them younger than I was. And so it was a good experience. And I left that and came to Davidson to work with the idea that maybe I would go back and finish seminary, because I'd really felt something stirring about being a pastor. And in the midst of all that, as I said earlier, Missy and I were getting right serious about each other. And I talked a lot with her, and she said, very wisely, she said, I think you're really supposed to follow this through to the end and see where it goes. And so I did come back to Davidson, and I worked, and we got married and spent the first year of our marriage here in Davidson. And my job shifted. I became what they call the fraternity liaison officer under the dean of students, which was the hardest job I've ever had, because I had to deal with people in the fraternities, and they were doing all kinds of hijinks that really weren't appropriate. Some of them were dangerous. And first thing I had to do was put my own fraternity on probation, which meant no more free meals there. But I did know at that point that that was a temporary job, and following that, went to Theological Seminary and finished seminary, was ordained to the ministry, spent a postgraduate year at Yale Divinity School doing a degree kind of specializing in preparation for campus ministry, and then left there. And I'm getting way ahead of myself, Jerry, but that's the end of my first foray into education anyway.
Well, I appreciate your emphasis on English. I've heard you give some eulogies that were just wonderful. I'm saving up my money to see if I can get you to do mine.
I'm out of business. Everybody's younger than I am now.
So talk a little bit about your early work in churches as a minister. How did that go?
Well, when I was finishing my postgraduate year at Yale Divinity School, I received an inquiry from the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Auburn, Alabama. That church had just taken on the responsibilities for campus ministry on the campus of Auburn University, and they were going to call somebody to be an associate pastor and campus minister. I hadn't done that in quite that way before. And Missy said that she heard my end of the conversation, and what she heard was something like, would I? Oh boy. I wasn't very cagey about whether or not I'd like to take the job. So fortunately, went down, interviewed, was invited to come, and spent 5 very, very special years as associate pastor in campus ministry in a church which was so unique for the Deep South at that time. I just can't believe I was fortunate enough that Providence shined on me enough to put me among people who educated me and who brought me up. It was 1965. It was the middle of the civil rights struggle. And an interesting thing had happened in that church because of strong leadership in years before. The church had really become unable to stay together with itself. There were 2 parties. One party was essentially a segregationist party, and the other party was open to the leading of the Spirit as to how the church was supposed to do with African Americans, not only in the church, but in the larger society. And right before I went there, about 9 months before I went there, there was a splinter group that left. And when I got there, it was really sweetness and light. I mean, it was lovely. And there were people in that church who had a lot more sensitivity to how you engage your conscience effectively in helping with that very difficult struggle that was going on in the middle of the 1960s. So I landed on my feet with people. The minister is still one of my dearest friends and buddies. We and I have this familial relationship in which he teases me all the time, and I kind of make over him as well. But we're just inseparable, and we had each other's backs in a very, very, very formative way during those years. So I learned a lot from lay people in that church, the editor of the local newspaper there. I was an elder in that church, one of my all-time heroes, maybe alongside my dad, maybe one of the greatest 2 or 3 men I've ever known in my life. So it was a good experience. The end of that experience, interestingly, Jerry, and I'll stop, but the end of that experience got tangled up with the heating up of the war in Vietnam, and we bombed Cambodia and all that. And there was a lot of turmoil on campus. It was an interesting thing to be a campus minister. My own attitude was increasingly anti-war because of the things that I saw and heard and learned about. At the same time, I was pastor to some young men, all young men as it happened then, who were in ROTC and who were putting on the gold bars or silver bars, whichever they are, as they graduated and going off to fight in Vietnam, and some of them getting killed. And some of the parts of my ministry I never thought I'd have to do. For example, going with an officer, a captain from Fort Bragg, over to the women's dormitory and waiting for a young woman to come back and taking an exam to tell her that her husband had been killed in Vietnam, and not simply killed. I didn't have to tell her this, but he'd been fragged. He'd been in his tent, and somebody within our American forces had pitched a hand grenade in and killed him. And it's just awful thing. I didn't have any kind of, really had to grow up as a human being with that kind of tension. The racial tension was one thing, and I was in the midst of a congregation that would probably have gone along with anything that I wanted to do, intended to do with regard to race relations. I went, for example, toward the end of my time there, I went to Atlanta for Dr. King's funeral with a group of my black friends from the community, and nobody raised an eyebrow. That was just what John ought to do, which was wonderful. The war thing, not so comfortable, and really I think it took a lot of growing up to know how to take my stand and be authentic to my own convictions, and at the same time not just absolutely aggravate people to the point that they couldn't stand being around me. So it was a learning experience for me. So I had 5 years there as campus minister. Loved every bit of it. Our 2 sons were born during that 5 years. Toward the end of that 5 years, unfortunately, we were driving through Atlanta going to a meeting, and a woman pulled out of a parking lot on our side of the road, and instead of turning 2 lanes over to go the other way, she turned one and hit us head on without even slowing down. Turned out she had too much to drink at about 3 in the afternoon, which was another agony of the whole thing. Our 2 sons were seriously injured, had head injuries. We spent a very, very uneasy week at the Eggleston Children's Hospital at Emory with these 2 boys, hoping for them to recover, regain consciousness, and all that. And Missy and I were beaten up pretty badly, but nothing that was going to harm us permanently by any means. And before the days of seat belts and chairs for children, sadly. But eventually that worked out all right. But it was a moment of truth, I guess, in my life, reminding me of the fragility of human life and informing me in no uncertain terms that I'm not immortal. It also informed me how much I dearly love and continue to love, and continue to love my 2 sons. When we got out of the hospital, Missy said I carried them around in my arms until they were about 7, 9. I don't know. I don't think that long, but I was very protective of them, very much aware of the fact that in the final analysis, they didn't have to be, that they were here just by the grace of God.
Wow.
So it was a turning point in my life in terms of being awareness of, and in some ways, being awareness of the strength of my faith, but also being aware of the great weakness that just inhabits human life just by the nature of things. I don't know what I would have done if both those boys had died. I don't know that I would have been able to carry on in ministry. I don't know that I've been able to carry on in, lots of people's marriages don't do very well when they have that kind of trauma in it. So it was a reminder of providential care and how you should be able to be prepared to cope with things. But really a turning point in life. Get off track a little bit. Anyway, I stayed at Auburn 5 years, wonderful 5 years, and then made the decision after long reflection and conversation with Missy that I would have preferred to spend my whole ministry on campus. But there's a certain half-life to being a campus minister. You work with the students, you stay with the students, you stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning talking to them in dormitory rooms and things like that. Then you got to get up at 7 so you get to work at 8 o'clock, and you got 2 children and all that. And I knew that I was kind of fading in my effectiveness as a campus minister because I just couldn't do it. I just physically couldn't do it. Didn't want to do that kind of thing. So I figured the only way I could stay around the campus and be of any use was to get the union card, get a PhD. And so I very fortunately was accepted to a graduate program at Princeton University and left Auburn, picked up Missy and the boys and put all of our belongings in a U-Haul trailer and went to New Jersey for a while.
Yeah, I want to take a break from your career just a minute to follow up on what you talked about a minute ago. You talked about your faith and how important it was when your sons were injured. As you know, in our Men in Balance ministry, that's what we're about, is trying to help men with their faith and their own spiritual development. I'm a little bit concerned when I read things from our survey, for example, from church-going men who say things like they feel like they're going through the motions at church. They're not the spiritual head of their family. They don't know exactly how to pursue their faith. I'd like maybe some words from you about what your reaction to that would be.
Number one, I don't think there are very few people around who ever go through their whole life without having dry seasons with respect to faith and with respect to the level of commitment that they're willing or able to bring to what it is they believe. I think that's just a given. And I think that I would not want to attach that simply to the potential trauma of losing 2 children. I think that there are dry spaces in life, that's just the way things go. Number 2, I think my perception of the Christian faith has been kind of like a kaleidoscope. I mean, there have been aspects of the faith which mean more to me at some time than at others, and there's a kind of a shifting picture with the passage of days and months and years in terms of what's important to me about my faith. There's some things that I found very easy to teach about, preach about, be very dedicated to when I was, say, 26 years old and in ministry, beginning in ministry, that I can't say anymore. But there are other things that I didn't know or didn't understand about the breadth of the whole Christian tradition, and beyond that, the spirituality which is kind of innate to almost all human beings. William James, in varieties of religious experience, says there are a few people who are just tone deaf to religion altogether, and I expect that's true. I think I've known some, though I wouldn't want to name names, but most people have a sense of the spiritual, which is much, much more vivid and present in life at some moments than at others. You get to be my age, I'm 82 and a half now. There's certain things about the temporary nature of life that are really very, very important to you. I'm not down to the not buying green banana stage of things, but sometimes when I buy a bottle of 400 pills, I wonder, Michael, ever use all these things up or not? So that means that there is a certain persistence of my mortality, which I can't get away from. And it also means that there's certain aspects of what has been said to me all through these years that really come into focus and have meaning. I don't quote the Bible chapters and verses very well, but there was something in Corinthians I read not long ago that just that said to me, I'm paraphrasing, but it said to me, you have been called to this life, and this will be your life for your whole life long. And I look back and I say, well, gosh, that's the way it's been. I mean, here I am, and sometimes going through the motions of going to church is what you have to do. And sometimes you get in a situation, only a couple of times in my life, and certainly I don't want to say it's happened to me in Davidson, but sometimes when there's no place that I want to go to be a part of the public worship of God, I haven't found a church home, some people would call it, but essentially I've had to say, okay, I'm going to tough it through this for the sake of putting the boys in Sunday school, or for the sake of a relationship that I have with somebody in this congregation, a friend or something. But I have been genuinely blessed through most of my life with the kind of church experience which has been so uplifting on the one hand, kind of encouraging, and on the other hand, been so helpful in making me critical of what it is I believe and why, and what things I can't believe. And, you know, I heard somebody say one time, some theologian said he could write everything he believed on a given day on a 3x5 card and have plenty of room for footnotes. You have that experience sometimes, but you keep on writing on 3x5 cards, and it's amazing the way that those things that you write there that you're really committed to and believe come in and out of focus in the course of a lifetime. Now, I've just said a lot more than I know.
No, that was
I think that that's the way it's gone for me. And I think one thing that you learn in all this, or you should be learning, is humility about what it is that makes you tick after all, when all's said and done. I think you better be very, very modest about how much control you got over these things that are happening in your life. That sounds too Presbyterian for your group, I suspect, but that's it.
Yeah, so my question, I guess, and probably a lot of folks wonder this, where does a minister go when he's feeling dry and yet has to produce a sermon for this weekend and comfort people in their loss and whatever?
Two ways to answer that. One, I asked that very question of the pastor who was my home pastor when I was growing up, and I said, what do you do when you've just been going flat out all week, and then you find out somebody's dying at the hospital and you're dead tired and you haven't seen your family? He said, you get up and do what you got to do. In other words, suck it up. You're not all that great. Go do what you're supposed to do. That's one answer, and that's a very pragmatic answer. The other answer is, I guess the other answer is it depends. In many instances, my relationship with Missy has been the thing that sustained me in tough times when I'm wrestling with things I can't get my arms around. And she's got the wit and wisdom to kind of straighten me out and get me back doing what I ought to do. I also, over the years, have discovered a few friends, maybe this living this long, maybe about 20 friends to whom I can turn with just anything I've got and say, hey, what's going on now? My conversation with my college roommate yesterday afternoon was not supposed to be any kind of therapy session for either one of us, but it was therapy because we knew that if we brought something serious to the table, the other one would have heard it, would have understood it, or would have understood the person that's saying it, and would have been of some help in sorting things out. So I think there have to be those people in your life. Sometimes they can be in your family. Sometimes you can't possibly have that person in your family. You have to go to somebody who's outside. You got a lot more perspective. I'll tell one brief story. One time I was really, really upset with some things that were going on in the place I was working. And there were about 120 20 people with whom I was working pretty closely, and some of them were just acting in outrageous fashion, and I couldn't quite figure out how to cope with it. So I came home from the meeting just grumpy and grumpy. Mrs. said, okay, I'm going to give you a rocket ship. It's got 6 seats on it. You can pick anybody out of that group of people, and you can put them on that rocket ship, and we'll launch it, and they'll never come back. They'll be gone. Okay, so I started. I said, well, there's old, and I'll just make up names. There's old Joe over here, and then there's Henry, and there's Richard, and there's, well, I guess I'd put Bobby on that list too. And then I couldn't get any more. I had 4, and I got them on the rocket ship, and it made me realize, all right, these are people that just now I can't find a way to work effectively with, and I may never, but they're few in number compared to the others who are people of goodwill, and we may differ on this or that, but we'll work it all out and we'll make it go. So, you know, that's one instance in which there was a wife there who had exactly the right thing to say to me at the time I needed it said to me, and it straightened me out so I could get up the next morning and go back to work.
Wow. You need to write a book about Missy's wisdom, don't you?
Yes.
That would
and
be
wit
great.
as well, but yeah.
So you had 2 stints as president of Davidson College, one intentional, one not so intentional, I guess. You want to talk about that a minute?
Yeah. There's an interim there of real significance in my life that I'll mention in just about two sentences, and that is when I was finishing my PhD work at Princeton, Auburn University had made the decision to open a Department of Religious Studies. And it's one of these things, and it bothers you sometimes, but it's always a part of life. It's who you know. And the person who was the dean was a person who had been a member of my congregation, a good friend. And he said, don't you want to come back and work at Auburn? And I said, oh, gosh, would I? Again. So after 3 years in New Jersey, we came back to Auburn for another 11 years, during which time I was a junior member for most of the time of a 2-person religion department, the senior person being now deceased, but being, again, one of those people I could turn to anytime. Very wise, bright, thoughtful Southern Baptist minister who had a Harvard PhD. And I worked with him for about 9 of those 11 years. And he left to go to be the dean at Mercer. And I then became the senior member of a 2-member department. And it was not long after that, Davidson called me. 2 things I learned during that time, which are very important in my life. One is that my true kind of baseline vocation, when all's said and done in ministry or in life, is the opportunity to be a teacher, which has always been, in retrospect, the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. So I learned that. Another thing I learned was you got to be an adult. You're getting into your 40s, and you can't just be piddling around playing church league softball. You've got to pay attention to things. I was chosen, somewhat surprisingly, to be the president of the faculty and chairman of the faculty senate at Auburn. There were 900 faculty members, and I was one of the junior of the 900, but I was asked to do that just at the time we were trying to get rid of the president. And I say that literally. We were trying to see that man out the door. There were reasons for it, which were good and substantial. The power forces involved in this, including the state legislature, including Governor George Wallace, and subsequently Governor Fob James, including the trustees, who were all chosen by the governor. The politics of it were right overwhelming, and there was a lot of innuendo thrown around. There was a lot of temptation. I was visited by the assistant to this president one time, and it was kind of like being taken to the pinnacle of the temple and looking down on the world. And, you know, that could be anything you want. I'm not Jesus, but this guy was offering me an endowed chair, and, you know, after teaching the classes, and you can just study and write and blah, 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 have any job that here you want. And I said, you trying to bribe me? Oh, no, but I asked him to leave. But anyway, so I had that kind of experience, and then all of a sudden, President Sam Spencer at Davidson, who served 15, 16 years of the most useful, most formative, most transformative years in the history of this college, because it was Sam who began the process of serious integration in terms of the races. It was Sam who brought the college over into co-education. It was Sam who put it on the map nationally, all these things. Sam was retiring, and they were looking for a successor to him. And I had no idea that I wanted to do anything in administration. My administration to that point had been trying to run a campus ministry or presiding over a two-person department in the university. And I must say, I don't think I did very well in the whole interview process, which lasted for 15 months. I think I was the last one left standing, and they came back and asked me to do it. But Davidson being my alma mater was the only hook in the whole thing. If you'd asked me to be a dean at Auburn, if you'd asked me to be president of any other college or something, which I wouldn't have been asked to, but if I had been, I said no. So it was alma mater attachment for me, and I have never known the ins and outs of all the search process, but at the end of about 15 months, I was invited to come back to Davidson to be president in 1984. It was simultaneous. The announcement and the invitation was almost exactly simultaneous with the unexpected death of my father in Charlotte, who, as I've said before, just kind of one of my icons in my life, one of the people I admired most and would like to be most like. So it was kind of, and my pop had been a Davidson alumnus, had been the president of Davidson Alumni Association. He found out he was in the hospital in what turned out to be the last week of his life. He had been, and one of the trustees had come to visit him and whispered in his ear that they were going to announce that I was going to be president. And his wise words to me was, "Well, I sure am glad you got that job, but I don't know why in the hell you want it." That was the wisdom. So anyway, came to Davidson. It was bittersweet to come to meet the college community for the first time, because we just had my dad's funeral within the last week and couldn't say anything about it until Davidson announced it and all that. So it was a really unusual moment, kind of transition in my life. But we moved here in 1984, and long story shorter, we've been here ever since. I was president for 13 years. I was supposed to be president for 10 years. We'd agreed to 2 5-year terms. And at the end of 10 years, there were certain things that were still unfinished business that the board said, "Would you stay on?" And I said, "Well, not 5 years, 3 is enough for me." So I stayed another 3 years, at which time I transitioned at Davidson. After a year sabbatical, I transitioned into the Department of Religion and was a full-time member of the Department of Religion for 6 years. I'd been a kind of an honorary member of that department and professor with tenure, and taught one course every term while I was president, except for two times when we were really too busy, couldn't do it. But I had kind of kept my hand in teaching, and it reinforced the feeling that I had that the place where I had real, genuine connections with people in the student generation was in the classroom. So that meant a lot to me.
Well, I can say, having been in some of your classes, you're an excellent teacher, facilitator, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. We're almost out of time, but before we leave, I want to talk about one of your traits, which is giving to your community and giving to others, and maybe what you would advise younger people who are in their career now to do in that regard, as far as giving back.
Jerry, I think for most of us, there's a natural proclivity to something outside yourself in the community. And sometimes it has nothing at all to do with your vocation. Sometimes it's very much connected to your vocation. I think what happened to me early on, after I got out of school, was there would be a one thing in which I could kind of invest myself and participate, not necessarily taking over and running the show by any means, but being there and being available and doing the things that I could do. And one of the things that I did early on, which it was a movement that I had very, very much commitment to. It was sponsored by the one interracial group in Lee County, Alabama, where I live, but it was the Head Start program. And so I worked with the Head Start program to facilitate getting the places they needed to work and be, and just kind of work behind the scenes. And then I remember at one stage for about 2 years, 3 years, I didn't do a thing for them but sign all the checks. And they bring me a stack of checks. But that was kind of a connection for me with that group, never mind whether I was certainly not in control of it, never mind whether I had a lot of time to spend on it, because I didn't. But I think you find one thing, maybe two things that you can do and do well. For many of us, it comes in the church too. And I'm a kind of quasi-layman ever since I went to teaching. I preach sometimes and do other things in church, but I have found until COVID, I have found that to be a Sunday school teacher, or to work with a youth group, which I've done a lot earlier, not in recent years, and be pretty much responsive to that institution has been a plenty for me in Davidson since, well, not since I retired. I did some other things early, but I've kind of laid aside some of these commitments that I've had. But I do think early on there's a need for alertness to something outside yourself, bigger than yourself, which you don't want to control, but you want to support.
That's important. And it's something I think a lot of us learn too late in life, and certainly makes a big difference. And I like your definition of it, something that is larger than yourself or gets you outside of yourself. In fact, that's one of my definitions of spirituality to start with. So yeah, I like what you said on that. John, our time is up. I thank you so much for giving us this time today. Fascinating interview, fascinating career, fascinating life you've had. And we appreciate you and thank you for what you've done.
Kind to ask. I'm amazed. 45 minutes. I didn't know I knew that much about myself. But thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it. Enjoyed being with you.
I've enjoyed it, and I hope we can do it again sometime. I'm Jerry Hancock from Men in Balance. Thanks for watching. And if you want to go to the website and sign up for the newsletter, then you'll know when these interviews are coming up and you'll be able to participate in those. Once again, thanks for watching. I'm Jerry Hancock from Men in Balance.